Especially in my country, I had friends who would get off the plane in Atlanta and want to go straight to a Kentucky Fried Chicken outlet. We're big chicken eaters in India, those who are non-vegetarians, of course, and would enjoy that, but also to be at a university that the basketball team can be so proud of. So when you combine a university, a basketball team, and chicken and all of that, it's truly a privilege to be here in Kentucky, because both goes into the stomach, goes into the head, and gives the heart some palpitations as well. So I did visit some of the restrooms that the team practices around so that I could tell people that I have a lot in common with the Wildcats. We shared a common room. All jokes aside, but maybe one little lighthearted comment. I was telling my buddies while we were flying in here from Atlanta this morning, and the weather was quite rough, but we managed to make it. This was sent to me from India, about this guy who's going to visit a doctor, and the doctor says to him, I have a few questions for you. What kind of toothpaste do you use? And he said, I use KP Nambudri's toothpaste. He said, what about the soap? He said, I use KP Nambudri's soap. He said, and the shampoo? He said, KP Nambudri's shampoo. He said, toothbrush? He said, KP Nambudri's toothbrush. So the doctor said, is this some kind of a famous international brand or what? He said, no, KP Nambudri is my roommate. And so I hope you and your roommate are here tonight. Being on a university campus, chances are not all of you are comfortable with the theme that is being addressed, or certainly you may not be very sympathetic to the message of the Christian faith. But you have given us the honor and courtesy of your attendance, and I'm very, very grateful that you have joined us tonight, especially if you are one who is on your journey or trying to figure out what this is really all about anyway. The themes that we cover on campuses are oftentimes given to us by people who invite us as to what would be relevant. And if we can't handle the subject on hand, we'll let them know. We have a team of about 47 speakers as my colleagues, placed in 15 different countries. And tonight I'm having the honor of Abdu Murray from Detroit, Michigan, joining me after I finish. He'll take a few minutes to talk to you, and then we will both field your questions. Abdu is a trained lawyer from the University of Michigan, got his law degree there. His roots go back to Lebanon, and now living, of course, in the United States. He's the author of the book, The Grand Central Question, and also one on understanding the critical analysis of various worldviews. So he'll join me later, and after I finish my talk, he'll take a few minutes and we will field your questions. I don't think it is questionable at all, but that we are living in very, very critical times. And I don't mean this to be a political statement, although it's a slanted comment on it. When I go overseas, as we cover a lot of countries, within about 10 days, I'll be doing a few campuses in India. And I have absolutely no doubt several of them are going to come up to me and say, what is going on in the American political arena? As they watch the debates, as they watch the vitriol, as they watch all kinds of strong language being used and personal attacks being made rather than ideas being questioned and challenged. We recognize full well that this is a time of crises on the global scene. Many years ago, I was in Syria, about 5-6 years ago, and I was a guest of the chief of intelligence in Damascus. They always called me in whenever I arrived to remind me not to get into the political turmoil of that part of the world. And I always gave them my word. But I looked at the chief of intelligence surrounded by the military brass, and I said to him, I don't get into the politics of the region, sir, but it would be very helpful to me if you can briefly tell me, what do you think is going on in this part of the world? I want you to know this was before anything like ISIS, any of the crises that had erupted, before the Arab Spring, and so on. And his answer to me shocked me because it was made in a statement or two. He said, Mr. Zacharias, if things do not change here within the next 5 years, this whole place is going to blow up. If things don't change here within the next 5 years or so, this whole place is going to blow up. And how do you come back with another question on that? The fact of the matter is that there is an incredible uncertainty as weapons of destruction pile up, and those controlling some of those weapons come from backdrops and political structures where they are more demagogically controlled than the will of the people or some ethical underpinning that drives their passions. And so I want to begin with two comments and then lead into a basic backdrop against which I want to address these issues of the four major questions of life. It was in the 1970s, I believe, that Malcolm Muggeridge, that prolific writer, made this comment. He said, "It is difficult to resist the conclusion that 20th century man has decided to abolish himself. Tired of the struggle to be himself, he has created boredom out of his own affluence, impotence out of his own erotomania, and vulnerability out of his own strength. He himself blows the trumpet that brings the walls of his own cities crashing down until at last, having educated himself into imbecility, having drugged and polluted himself into stupefaction, he keels over a weary, battered old brontosaurus and becomes extinct." Now, the fascinating thing about Muggeridge is that as a journalist and as one who described himself as being fatally fluent, lived an indulgent life, was a latecomer to Christ, also a chaplain of the University of Edinburgh, resigned his position from the chaplaincy when he saw the trend of where education was going, and on the basis of all of that, talked about how we'd created boredom out of our own affluence, impotence out of our own erotomania, vulnerability out of our own strength, and how this weary, battered old brontosaurus keels over and becomes extinct. About a few years before he said that, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. received the Nobel Prize for Peace. And here was a man who was so articulate and so precise in what he said and impassioned in what he believed. Listen to these words in his speech. "I accept this award today with an audacious faith in the future of mankind. I refuse to accept the idea that the isness of man's present nature makes him morally incapable of reaching up for the eternal oughtness that forever confronts him. I refuse to accept that man is mere flotsam and jetsam in a river of life. I refuse to accept the view that mankind is so tragically bound to the starless midnight of racism and war that the bright daybreak of peace and brotherhood can never become a reality. I refuse to accept the cynical notion that nation after nation must spiral down a militaristic stairway into the hell of thermonuclear destruction." Now here's the line. "I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality." I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality. So to you as young, bright minds in one of the finest universities of the world, I have this question to you. If our entire educational ethos is built on naturalism and a scientific single vision of ultimate reality, which discipline in that framework gives to you the imperatives of unarmed truth and unconditional love? These are philosophical principles. This is not given to us by the exact sciences. I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality. What of the exact sciences gives you this eternal oughtness that forever confronts us? And so I say to you, whatever world you will live in, and when you're sitting down and somebody introduces you and says, "You know what, next month he's going to turn 70, you say, "My word, I didn't know that myself." But it's true. The calendar does not lie. And we are reminded again and again of, as each passing year comes and goes, that the world is changing at a staggering pace. I have no idea what kind of world will be yours 10 to 15 years from now, but I'm hoping it is the kind of world that Dr. King talked about, the bright daybreak of peace and brotherhood. What a glorious thing it would be to have unarmed truth and unconditional love, because truth is the most powerful weapon in the world, and love is the most supreme ethic in the world. Where do we find these? The philosopher who lived between 1844 and 1900 was the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. His father was a pastor, both of his grandfathers were pastors, but somewhere he clenched his fist at God and philosophically believed it could no longer be sustained. And he wrote this parable. You will recognize it. I will read it for you in extenso, a few paragraphs, because on this I want to build my deductions. Have you not heard of that madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours, ran to the marketplace and cried incessantly, I'm looking for God, I'm looking for God. As many of those who did not believe in God were standing together there, he excited considerable laughter. Have you lost him, said one. Did he lose his way like a child, said another. Maybe God is hiding. Is he afraid? Is he afraid of us? Has he gone on a voyage or emigrated? So they shouted and laughed him to scorn. But the madman sprang into their midst and pierced them with his glances. Where is God? He cried. I'll tell you, we have killed him. You and I, we are all his murderers. But how have we done this? How were we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us a sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What did we do when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving now? Away from all suns, maybe? Are we not perpetually falling forwards, backwards, sidewards, in all directions? Do you notice the metaphors he's using here? They are poignant. Are we not perpetually falling? Backwards, forwards, sidewards. Is there any up or down left? Are we not straying through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not suddenly become colder? Is not more and more night coming on us all the time? Must not lanterns now have to be lit in the morning hours? Do we not hear anything yet of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Do we not smell anything yet of God's decomposition? God's decomposed too, you know, and he's dead. He remains dead, and we killed him. Now, how shall we, the murderer of all murderers, compose ourselves? Because that which was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet possessed has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood from us? With what water should we purify ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games will we need to invent? Is this not the greatest of deeds, too great for us to handle? Must not we now ourselves become God, simply to seem worthy of it? There's never been a greater deed, you know, and whoever shall be born after us for the sake of this deed shall be part of a different history than all history hitherto. This tremendous event is still on its way, still traveling, and has not yet reached the ears of men. The madman fell silent and regarded his listeners. They too were silent. They stared at him in astonishment. He threw his lantern to the ground and it broke, and he went out. I come too early, maybe my time has not yet come. It has been related further on the same day that the madman entered diverse churches and there sang a requiem, Aeternam Deo. Let out and quieted, he is said to have retorted each time, what are these churches now if they are not the tombs on the sepulchres of God? God is dead. We have killed him. I remember taking some courses with the famed Don Cupid, who was professor at Emmanuel College, Cambridge University. He was an Anglican priest turned atheist. And I remember on more than one occasion he would walk up to the window and point to the school opposite and the spires of a church, and he said, this was all our heritage at one time. It's gone. We no longer can believe any of this. Ironically, a few miles down the road was John Polkinghorne, one of the leading quantum physicists who was a latecomer to Christ, in whose lectures he would be arguing for the rationality and the defense of God's existence. And so the worldviews collide. If you take Nietzsche's words, then I have 4 unanswered questions that will bring coherence to your life and mine. The first is this: where do we find our moral framework? Where do we find a moral law? If naturalism is completely in control, if materialism is all that there is, and there is no absolute, remember what Nietzsche said, there is no up and down. There is no up and down. And so if you listen to politics, it's right or left. There is no up and down. They don't believe in the vertical, transcendent notion anymore. Will lanterns have to be lit in the morning hours? What sacred games will we need to invent? Are we not perpetually falling? As Chesterton said, there's only one angle at which you can stand straight and many, many angles at which you can fall. Chesterton went on to say the tragedy of disbelieving in God is not that you end up believing in nothing. Alas, it is much worse. You may end up believing in anything. And we're testing the angles now. Where is there a moral law? The irony of this is as follows. Adolf Hitler took the Nietzschean phrase of a higher history, took the writings of Nietzsche, personally presented Nietzsche's writings to Stalin and Mussolini, and between these 3 created a kind of a hell in this world. And I've given the illustration so many times, but I never tire of it, because we are always not far away from being forced to repeat the same mistakes. It was in the 1980s, during the Cold War, when I happened to be visiting Poland and Russia. I'd never been to those parts of the world before, and my host in Warsaw took me one day to visit the concentration camp of Auschwitz. I had been to Buchenwald and Dachau and some of the other camps, but they were not death camps, so emotionally I was not prepared for it. And when you walk into Auschwitz, the only thing you hear in those confines, I kid you not, is silence. You don't hear anything. Probably, if I'm being brutally specific with it, the one thing I did hear was a young gal storming out of there and then bursting into sobs and going outside to sit in the front veranda of that building. And when we walked out, I still saw her sitting there holding her face in her hands. She was a young woman. She saw what had happened. You see, at Auschwitz alone, they were obliterating them at 12,000 every day. And Eichmann's comment was that the first time he saw what happened and got the report of a whole lot of them being herded into the gas ovens, denuded, shaven, the head shaven off, and leaning flesh against flesh, already emaciated, they were told they were going into the showers. And when they would be taken into that room and the gas spigots would be turned on, they would only be able to hear 1 or 2 people screaming out, gas, and that's all they would hear, and the bodies were literally shoveled out. Eichmann said, as painful as it was the first time, I learned we were now able to disperse of many, many bodies at the same time and do it in the quickest possible way. He said, 1 death is a tragedy, 1,000,000 deaths is a statistic. But just outside the gas ovens were the words of Hitler. I want to raise a generation of young people devoid of a conscience, imperial, relentless, and cruel. What they did with kids there, what they did with womankind there, as many people were dragged into this onslaught who didn't want to be dragged in, who never realized what they were going into. When I wrote a book called Jesus Talks to Hitler in a great conversation series, I went to Nuremberg with one of my colleagues who's an authority on that to help me with my research. The first thing that struck me in the judgment hall at Nuremberg, just above the tribunal, were the 10 Commandments. And as you leave the hall, above the door, or I forget above or beside it, was the Garden of Eden and the temptation, you shall be as gods, knowing good and evil, meaning defining good and evil. So here was the challenge. Were they going to let God be God, or were they going to become definers of good and evil? Now, the important thing to state here is to understand what I am not saying. I am not saying for a moment that an atheist by definition is an evil person, a mass murderer, this and that. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm just wanting to point out that once you do away with the absolute, once you do away with the existence of God, where do you turn for your absolutes? Where do you turn? How do we get an answer? Probably the most recent work of Sam Harris made a noble effort at trying to talk about the moral landscape. And of course, he transposed positions from talking about morality to well-being. And then he himself concedes towards the end that yes, we have a lot of psychopaths in the country, about 3 million of them, and a person can be a mass murderer and still be extremely happy. And in a puzzling conclusion, then ends up not really with an absolute, but some kind of a continuum. And so the man today who stands in front of the lens of a camera and uses a sword without even having the courage for his or a face to be seen to behead somebody can also say to you and to me, he is doing this for geopolitical well-being. It's exactly what they believe. I have sat across tables and discussed, dialogued, and asked such questions. And I say the discussion, even amongst philosophers, is a divided house. Kai Nielsen, the renowned atheist from Calgary, we have not been able to show that reason requires the moral point of view, or that really rational persons, unhoodwinked by myth or ideology, need not be individual egoists or classical amoralists. Reason doesn't decide here. The picture I have painted for you is really not a pleasant one. Reflection on this actually depresses me. Pure, practical reason, even with a good knowledge of the facts, will not take you to morality. This is a very outspoken atheist. He says this, even with a good knowledge of the facts, will not take you to morality. Richard Rorty, if moral imperatives are not commanded by God's will, and if they are not in some sense absolute, then what we wish to be is a matter simply of what men and women decide should be. There is no other source of judgment. Two renowned atheists. Bertrand Russell says, you know what? I cannot live as though ethical values were simply a matter of personal taste, but I find my own views incredible. I do not know what the real solution is. There has to be a rational justification above all of our differences. And this is especially important for America at this time in her history, where pluralism is a design, and it is a good design. I happen to be a privileged one who was born in one part of the world, at the age of 20 moved to the other part of the world, and because the doors of these nations were open with a legitimate pluralism, people like me could come here, earn a living, raise our families. But the absolutes that built this nation are now in serious jeopardy, and we had better realize it. The absolutes that built this nation, because the nation talked about the fact that there were naturally endowed rights given to us, that these truths were self-evident. All of these moral statements are very critical to understand in the light of our pluralistic culture in our time. I know by going to places in the world right now, people look at me and will ask the question, what is going on in the West? What is going on? Was it not Adolf Eichmann who finally, when he was tried in Israel and was sentenced to the death penalty, I was there when they were dealing with all of the evidence and was given several pages and pages of the trial, which I was able to get back before I wrote my book. But here's Hannah Arendt describing Eichmann's last moment. This is critical, and I move to my next thought here. Adolf Eichmann went to the gallows with great dignity. He'd asked for a bottle of red wine and drank half of it. He refused the help of a Protestant minister, the Reverend William Hull, who offered to read the Bible with him. He had only 2 more hours to live, and therefore he said, good, quote, I have no time to waste. He walked the 50 yards from his cell to the execution chamber, calm and erect, with his hands bound behind him. When the guards tied his ankles and knees, he asked them to loosen the bonds so that he could stand straight. I don't need that, he said. When the black hood was offered to him, he was in complete command of himself. Nay, he was more than that. He was completely himself. Nothing could have demonstrated this more convincingly than the grotesque silliness of his last words. He began by stating emphatically that he was a Gottgläubiger, to express in Nazi fashion that he was no Christian and did not believe in life after death. He then proceeded, quote, after a short while, gentlemen, we shall all meet again. Such is the fate of all men. Long live Germany, long live Argentina, long live Austria. I shall not forget them. In the face of death, he had found the cliché used in funeral oratory. Under the gallows, his memory played in the last trick. He was elated, and he forgot that this was really his own funeral. It was as though in those last minutes he was summing up the lesson. I want you to hear this now. It was as though in those last minutes he was summing up the lesson that this long course in human wickedness has taught us, the lesson of the fearsome word and thought-defying banality of evil. Evil had become trivial. The man who arrested Eichmann in a cloak and dagger operation in Argentina tells the story. He's now long gone. But he tells the story that he was bringing him back. If you've read the book, the House on Garibaldi Street, you know exactly how they got him. They waylaid him, they stalked him, ultimately put an injection into him and knocked him out and brought him up under a different name in a plane. The Mossad had done its work to bring him back. And the man who brought him back looked at him, sat down next to him in the train, and he broke his own code. He wasn't supposed to talk to him. But he couldn't resist this. He said, Mr. Eichmann, I have a question for you. Every day I watched you from a distance. I saw you getting off the bus, looking over your shoulder, carrying your briefcase there in that little town in Argentina. Just before you entered your own home, you would turn around to make sure nobody was watching. I was watching you, sir, from a distance, behind the bushes. I was watching you. But I noticed something, Mr. Eichmann. Every day, as you opened the door, there was a young boy who was waiting for you and leaped into your arms. Who was that boy? He said, he was my son. He said, Mr. Eichmann, how old is your son? He said, 8. He said, you killed my nephew who was 8. Can you tell me what was the difference? And Peter Malkin, with the Israeli Mossad, was sitting by his bed waiting for the answer, and Eichmann turned to him and said, Peter, my son was not Jewish. Malcolm said, he got up from there and walked away and sobbed with uncontrollable tears. He never wanted to see this man again. The bright daybreak of peace and brotherhood had not yet become a reality. Where are we going to turn from moral law? Where am I going to find your value and my value? If you don't have essential value, we are dependent upon the state to give us value. You know, Moses gave the people 613 laws. David reduced it to 15. Isaiah reduced it to 11. When Jesus was on the earth, they asked him, which is the greatest commandment? Jesus could have very easily said one. He didn't. He said that you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind and all your strength, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. He said, on these two commandments hang all of the laws and the prophets. That you and I are made imago Dei, the image of God, is a unique truth to the Judeo-Christian worldview. In the same chapter in the Bible, there's a conversation between a man who comes to Jesus and said, is it all right to pay taxes to Caesar? How wonderful it would have been if Jesus had said no. Jesus said, "Do you have a coin?" The man said, "Yes." He said, "Give it to me." He held the coin out to him and he said, "Whose image is on this?" The man said, "Caesar." He said, "Give to Caesar that which belongs to Caesar, and give to God that which belongs to God." The man should have had a follow-up question. The follow-up question should have been, "What belongs to God?" And Jesus would have said, "Whose image is on you?" Whose image is on you? This is what gives you your unique essential worth. In a moral framework that moves horizontally without moving vertically, there is no essential worth. There is no eternal oughtness that forever confronts us. I have no right to violate you as an individual. I have no right to violate your property. I have no right to invade your life because you are made in the image of God. You have a right to make your choices. I have no right to stand in the way of your choices either. But the choices will always have consequences. And so what I say to you is, God gives you the greatest compliment in telling you you're made imago Dei. And Jesus Christ takes that so specifically. He says to you that your body and mine are the temple of the living God. We don't go to the temple, we take the temple with us. This is inviolable. The moral law that Martin Luther King talks about, the eternal oughtness. And people often say, yes, he was very much inspired by Mahatma Gandhi, which is true. Mahatma Gandhi's life in ahimsa, non-violence, had a lot of an inspiration. But let me tell you two things about that. Mahatma Gandhi would never have used the term unconditional love. Because that is very much from the Judeo-Christian worldview. And Gandhiji carried a New Testament wherever he went and often would quote from the Sermon on the Mount. And it is fascinating that in one of Gandhi's homes in India is a quote by Bertrand Russell. And outside that home, the banner says this: "It is doubtful that the Mahatma would have succeeded in his effort except that he was appealing to people with a Christianized conscience." So here was an atheist applauding the success of a pantheist because of appealing to the conscience of a theist. You see how important it is to understand that a moral law has to have this transcendent value. But secondly and quickly, not only is the question of a moral law unanswerable from a horizontal perspective, Guy Nielsen sustains that. Even J.L. Mackie argues for the struggle. You've got several atheists who Michael Ruse deals with the same issue. Richard Rorty. They all bring up the question of where do we go for an absolute objective moral law? But the second question is that of meaning. How do I really find meaning in my life? Recently, I had the privilege of speaking at a conference called Passion. Some of you are out here who are at that conference. 40,000 in a live audience in 3 venues and tens of thousands scattered across listening in from about 115 different universities in 47 countries, 18 to 24 or so, that age bracket. Many of those who went forward to find help, do you know what were the 2 most important issues in their lives for which they sought help, 18 to 24? Number 1 was among the young guys, especially struggling with pornography. And number 2 was the stalking, haunting fear of suicide. I don't know if they ever saw the logical connection. Pornography denudes the other person. Doesn't just disrobe, denudes the other person in exchange for a feeling. The person who's hooked by it is not looking for a person. The person who's hooked by it is looking for a feeling ultimately that no one person in the world can satisfy. And once you have robbed the other person of any value, you ultimately denude your own self, and there is no purpose and meaning found. Now, that logical connection wasn't there in my life, but the end result still was. I came to know Christ on a bed of suicide when I was 17 years old in Delhi because I had no meaning in my life. I didn't care what anybody was saying to me. It all didn't add up. It simply didn't make sense. People say, what does meaning really mean? It's a long talk one can give on its own, but let me just tell you, meaning is found with 4 components. A sense of wonder. We watch children reading fairy tales and being read to in fairy tales, and the enchantment is awesome. They want this sense of wonder. But as they grow up, they begin to struggle, and they say the fairy tales are not true, they were merely fantastic. They were mere fantasy. Now they're looking for that which is fantastically true. Wonder, truth. Thirdly, the experience of love. And finally, the knowledge of security. If you're really looking for meaning, to build a coherent worldview, you're going to have these four components: wonder, truth, love, and security. I will deal with just one of them as I bring my message to a close. But here it is, this sense of a moral law that we cannot find, the quest for meaning that we hunger after. Let me give you an illustration of this. One existentialist writer wrote a play a long time ago called The Adulterous Woman. A woman who had just wanted to flirt with all this kind of stuff, but she had held back and never indulged in it. So her husband takes her into a town where he's dealing with his works and jewelry and all of that. At the end of it, he comes back exhausted, and he is in bed, and the woman thinks to herself, everything I saw in town, tonight's my night to have a last fling. I will never have it again. And he's sound asleep. She wakes up, gets dressed, goes out into the night, and expends herself in ways she had never, ever dreamed. She spent herself into pleasure and exhausted with pleasure. She comes back in the early hours of the morning, opens the door while he is still sound asleep. She slips under the covers, but there's a big problem. She cannot fall asleep now. On her pillow, the tears are rolling down the side of the face. And her husband hears the sobs and wakes up and looks at her and said, "What's the matter?" She brushes him aside and says, "Nothing, just nothing." See, the loneliest moment is when you have just experienced that which promised you the ultimate and it has let you down. The loneliest moment is when you've just experienced that which has promised you the ultimate and it has let you down. I look at you tonight as young students and I say, and you're really the primary reason I'm here, by the way, because I care for the student world. I care for the young life that is living today, almost skidding out of control with no answers. The meaning that Christ offers to you is a meaning in a personal relationship. Justice Antonin Scalia just passed away last week, and some of the channels were playing some of his major speeches. He was considered one of the brightest intellectuals on the Supreme Court bench. Whether you agreed with him or not is not the issue here. Even those who disagreed with him were good friends and said the man was made of sterling character. And in his speech, I was just puttering around the house and I heard him make 3 statements back to back. And I thought, what on earth is this about? He was behind the lectern, he said, "I want you all to hear me." He said, "Sophisticated thinkers can believe in God." That's what he said. Next statement, sophisticated thinkers can believe in a personal God. Third statement he made, sophisticated thinkers can believe in the person of Jesus Christ, the very Son of God. And meaning comes ultimately in finding the sacred that binds the diversity of your proclivities and gives it that homogeneity of a supreme expression that is bound by the skin of the sacred. The sacred is what gives life meaning. So you know where the boundaries are, you know where the purpose is. Moral law, unanswered. Where do we find the sacred? And if we don't find the sacred, we have no meaning. Where are the answers? Thirdly, and quickly I say to you, what about hope? Where is hope really found if life ends in the grave? One of my great privileges is to speak to our military bases. I'll be doing 2 or 3 of them this year. I've always gone there to minister to our men and women in the armed forces. Whenever it is finished, they always line up and will talk to me to have a word of prayer and talk about the dangers with which they live. I was led into this when I was 25 years old, speaking in Vietnam. I was a young undergraduate student, invited to speak in Vietnam, going from military base to military base. And I saw death on the side of the highways. I saw death as we flew in the choppers all around, going from one venue to another. I saw death and dying in military hospitals, where in some places, unless you had a burn on your body, there were 2 bodies to each bed. And when I saw the horrors of that kind of warfare, I said, what are we doing to our fellow human beings? And yet these are the very ones who look for hunger and look for hope. I was just meeting a gentleman from Egypt before we came in here. My colleagues and I were in Egypt in November. And one night we spoke to a large number of young people. On that given night alone in Cairo, over 500 young men and women responded to the invitation to follow Jesus Christ. Their life had been empty. They realized the moment had come to see what it is that Christ offered to them. And before I moved to my final thought, I had a dialogue with Sheikh Hussein, the leading Shia cleric in Syria. He sat from the table there with an interpreter, always kept addressing me as professor, even though I told him I wasn't a professor. But he kept respectfully calling me Professor Zacharias, Professor Zacharias. He would ask me a question about my faith, I would answer him. I would ask him a question about his faith, he would answer me. What a marvelous moment of a few moments they were to dialogue cordially with somebody of a different worldview. And people listening to this for nearly 3 hours. When it was over, he leaned forward and said something through the interpreter. I said, what did he say? He said, Mr. Zacharias, maybe it's time for me and my people who follow a different faith to stop asking if Jesus died on the cross and to start asking why. I said, Sheikh Hussein, may I quote you on that, sir? He said, yes, you may. You have to ask yourself the question, in the gospel narrative, the cross is central. Why? Because your greatest need is not for a political leader. Your greatest need is not for the best of education. All of those are important. But your need and my need, the greatest need we have, is deep within our own heart, where evil stalks and seeks to take over. Our greatest need is for a Savior. Our greatest need is for a Savior. No moral law, no meaning, no hope. And lastly, I say, the supremacy of the ethic of love. The supremacy of the ethic of love. Think of this. Where do we go to understand love? Would you allow me just a personal illustration of this? You know, Winston Churchill was once asked by a corporal, Mr. Churchill, have I ever talked to you about my grandchildren? Churchill said, no, and I want you to know how much I appreciate it. So I won't bore you with my grandchildren's stories, but since I'm not Churchill, can I tell you at least one? I have a 4-year-old grandson. His name is Jude. I don't know where he gets his vocabulary from. I really don't. One day he leans over at the dinner table a few months ago and he says, Papa, what is the meaning of sophomoric? I told my daughter, you better watch this guy. If he's using the word sophomoric, which I didn't even understand till I was in my 20s and was probably very sophomoric in my behavior at that time. But one day his mother, when he was about just a little over 3, his mother had lost her car keys. And she's looking around the house and can't find it. And she slapped her forehead and said, I must be losing my mind. Jude comes over in front of her, looks her in the eye and says, Mommy, whatever you do, please don't ever lose your heart, because I'm in there. And I ask you, where did that intuitive statement come to him from? Where did that statement come to him from? See, the longing for love is very real in your life and mine. But we only think of romantic love, or we only think of other loves. In the Greek language, there are 4 loves: agape, storge, phileo, and eros. Storge, protective love; phileo, friendship love; eros, romantic love. It all hangs on agape, which is God's love. If you lose God's love, you cannot define the other three. And so the love that you and I long for, that binds it all together for you and me, which is something that, by the way, Bertrand Russell himself said he never found in life. And when I go from place to place in this world to preach the love of Christ, I think of this, and I close with this. In John 3:16, the Bible says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life." About 25 words, depending on which exact translation you use. About 25 words. What do you have in all of that? You have that which is causal. God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. You have that which is filial. You have that which is sacrificial. You have that which is relational. You have that which is eternal. And it is all bound up in the judicial. It is all bound up in the judicial. Causal, filial, relational, eternal, sacrificial, all bound up in the judicial. We say we are a country of laws. I say to you, God is the one in whom there is no contradiction, and the moral law is an intrinsic part of his character. Everything in love, everything in sacrifice, everything in relationship, everything that he offers to you and me is built within the legal framework of God's being, in whom there is no contradiction. Where there is contradiction, there is breakdown. So in these four issues alone, of law, meaning, hope, and love, they are the unanswered questions of naturalism. There is no objective source of defining them. In the Judeo-Christian worldview, they correspond to reality in measuring it. They cohere in a worldview. And so I present to you that option as worthy of your investigation. That's why Jesus said, "I am come that they might have life and have it more abundantly." We'll have a chance to take your questions. May God richly bless you. Thank you for giving me a hearing.
Thank you.